Hello, I am Nima Boscarino. This is my info for Twitter. I am an instructor at Lighthouse Labs, which is a web bootcamp in Canada. Now, today we're going to explore React hooks. So maybe you know a little bit about React, maybe you've heard about hooks, and you want to learn about what hooks are. This is a good place to start. We're exploring the useState hook today. Now, to give you some context, this video will only really make any sense if you already know a little bit about React. Specifically, you kind of need to know the basics of functional components, meaning props and JSX. If those two words don't make any sense to you, if they don't mean anything to you, this is probably not the video for you just yet. In fact, here is a bunch of code that I want you to kind of take a look at. If this code does not make sense to you, then the rest of the video won't make sense to you. So what's going on here is I have a hello world component that presumably receives a name and displays it. Here I'm using hello world and giving it a name, and I'm actually seeing it in my browser. Hello, Bradlina. So what we're going to do is we're not going to work on this hello world example, but instead I'm going to make a component called counter. So we're going to explore what useState is, and in a broader sense, what a React hook is. Right? So we'll say that this counter component is going to basically display a number. So we'll say display a number. And it's also going to have a button to increase the number. Right. So I might start off by saying that this counter component is going to return, I'll say a div. That div might have an h1 that says count. And maybe it says count is 0. And then I'll also put in a button. And my button's going to say click. And that's all that my component for my counter is going to be right now. And I want to make sure that I'm actually using that counter component. So I say counter is in my app. Now, here is count 0. It says click. That's all the stuff I wrote over here. I could even, in fact, use this counter as many times as I want. And I'll see the same counter be displayed multiple times. For right now, we're just going to have 1. Now, I don't want this number to be hard-coded like that. I don't want it to say count 0 directly. Maybe what I want to do is say, okay, there is going to be a number. I'll start it at 0. And then, since this is JSX, I can actually put in a little curly braces and say, just display the number in there. So I don't immediately see any change over here. But I know that this code is slightly different than it was before. And what I want to do is, when I click on this button, I want to increase the number. So I might have on my button an on-click. So you can pass on-click to a button and say, okay, well, when you click this button, I want you to run a function. The function that I want to run, I'm going to call it increase count, or increase, we'll just call it increase number. There is no function called increase number right now, so I'm going to make it const increase number. Now, I've made the completely arbitrary choice of writing this as an arrow function, right, and writing this as an assignment instead of a function declaration. I just really like writing functions like this, but you can write them any way you want. I've also decided to write it inside of this function here instead of outside of it. Again, that's my kind of arbitrary choice. I like having this in here. Part of why I want to write this like this, though, is so that I can just go number plus plus. Right? So when increase number runs, it'll find the number that's in scope and go number plus plus and increase it. Now what I'm going to find is that when I click, I want to run this increase number function, and I click, and absolutely nothing happens. And this is very annoying, because I might ask myself, is this function even running at the moment? It's not giving me an error. So I could try it by going alert hello world, and then I can see, click, and hello world actually pops up. I do get that alert. So this function is running. So evidently, when I just increase number like this, it doesn't actually display the new number on my screen. What we have to do here is we have to think about the way that our components actually exist. This here is a function. Counter is a function. It's being used as a component, but it is a function. And what it does is it runs each one of these lines, and then it gets to the return statement, and then technically it never runs again. And technically it doesn't run again until somebody calls it. So if my return statement returns count, and then the number, which might have been 0, and then the button, that is what gets displayed on the screen. And even if I increase the number, my return statement actually won't run again. So even if I go increase number and I run, like I run it 4 or 5 times, I'm never getting a new value of JSX to print on the screen. Instead, what I have to do is I need to tell React to actually rerun this component. Right? So it's not enough for me to say number plus plus. I want something that says increase the number, right, and re-render the component. Right? Increase the number and re-render the component. And that's going to be a little bit more complicated than number plus plus. Luckily, this actually isn't very hard. What we're looking at here is a value, like number, that React actually just needs to remember. Right? My component needs to remember this. Right? It needs to remember this because this value might change and I want to be able to display it. So what we call this in React is we call it state. This is a stateful value. So React's going to give us this. I can import from React a function called useState. Right, so this is something that's built into the React library. It's just a special function. Basically, instead of writing my code like this, let number equals 0, I'm going to instead go const number equals useState, and then I give it an initial value, 0. Now, I need to actually wrap this around with square brackets. And the reason for this is that useState actually returns an array instead of a single value. If this syntax here is confusing for you, I do recommend looking up array destructuring. And that might help you understand the syntax a little bit more. But for right now, I'll just say that it returns back an array, and the first value there is going to be that number that I want. I'm going to find that right now, if I save this code, genuinely nothing happens. Like, it doesn't break. It's totally fine. In fact, I could even go here and change this 0. And if you're into tinkering, you might want to play around with that. That is an initial value, right? So I can change what my starting is. I'll start it at 0. Now, what I have is a value that React is able to remember. But I'm going to find that I can't actually update it the way that I thought I might have been able to. If we take a look here, I go const number equals useState. And then I'm inside of increase number, I'm saying number plus plus. And the error that I get when I try to increase the number is assignment to constant variable. That's because I can't increase or I can't change a const. So my intuition might be to change this to a let, right? If my error is saying, okay, well, number is a constant, fine, I'll change it to a let. And I could save and I could try again. And that's not doing anything either. So the thing here is that useState actually returns a value that I can't change through normal methods. I can't assign it. I can't increase it. And instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a second value that comes out of this function call here, which I'm going to call setNumber. You can call this thing anything you want. So, oops. So, if this was like name, often you might see people call this setName. Right? I've called it number, so I'm going to call this setNumber. And what setNumber is a function that lets me actually set the number. So if I wanted to set it to an increased version of that, I can go set number to whatever my number used to be plus 1. I'm going to comment this one out here because I'm not using that anymore. And what I want you to know is that set number is a function that increases the number in this case, because I'm saying set number to number plus 1, and it re-renders the component. So we're going to save this, click, and there we go. We got a number that is increasing. So the main thing to see from something like this is that useState is going to return two values, the actual value and also a function that lets you change that value. Now, it might not be very clear right now what the usefulness of something like this is beyond making little counters. If I had multiple counters, now let's see multiple counters. And it's curious that I can click on these and actually have independent counters. And so, we might ask ourselves, well, why might we want to do something like this? One reason this could be useful for us is if we take a look at something like YouTube, for example, each of these, which is a separate component, each of these video thumbnails, has its own state. Right? We can see that it is auto-playing for itself. And they're using something similar to useState to build something like this. And, in the future, we might actually build something similar to that. The important thing, though, for us to see here is that I can only change this value by calling set and then, whatever I ended up calling this function here, so set number in this case. And then also, when I refresh, my values all go back to the original values. So useState is an example of a hook. A hook is just a function that gives us extra functionality in our components. In this case here, this one super boosts our components to have stateful values.